Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy here at Catholic Studies Academy. And today our topic is going to be Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. It's so fun to say.
What a name, right? I mean, gosh, I'm embarrassed by one syllable, last name. I mean, Smith, how boring compared to that.
Yeah. You need more German in you.
Maybe Ludwig Wittgenstein or something like that, right?
Yeah. Germans had good names and good beards.
That's right. Yeah. Good beard too.
So anyways, we're going to talk about Hegel today, and particularly Hegel's idea of history. One that's very important to understanding the development of philosophical thought and even understanding other people's thoughts. It came after Hegel that are still very influential today.
Sure.
Having a good understanding of this can help us and give us some insights into understanding different people that we'll talk about here in a second. So before we get started, though, I want to ask all of our listeners, please share this content. Please hit that like button, subscribe button. It really helps us out, helps us grow the channel beyond our classes that we have over at Catholic Studies Academy. Dr. Smith is just launching one entitled The Crisis of Philosophy, and he's particularly looking at the 20th century philosophy in that. But we're going to go a little bit further back today
right,
to understand Hegel. So, Dr. Smith, get us started here. Maybe give us a good little intro to Hegel, and maybe particularly for this episode, what is Hegel's idea of history?
Sure. Yeah. So, Hegel is, so important. He's probably the most influential 19th century philosopher. By the end of his life, he was kind of almost like the official Prussian state philosopher, right? Literally, like he had the whole Prussian state mourned his death, like the universities were all like, our greatest light has died, he was just loved, right? In Germany. Now, there were some German philosophers like Schopenhauer who despised him, but nevertheless, he was very highly thought of by the end of his life. If you wanted to be like a wealthy, successful, popular philosopher, Hegel's a good model for you, right? Actually, like he got it done, man, in a way that a lot of philosophers didn't. But he's a fascinating figure, and probably there's several reasons why he's important. The most obvious is the way he influenced subsequent thinkers, especially what were later came to be called the young Hegelians or the left-wing Hegelians. And that would include people like Feuerbach, right? Who wrote really, sort of pretty damning critiques of Christianity as forms of self-projection, things like that. And then also, most importantly, Karl Marx. And one of the things you have to say about Marx, whether whatever you think about his political theory, his political economy, it's not even close. I mean, he is the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. I mean, like his writings changed the world, radically. Empires fell, people died, new civilizations rose. I mean, based on his writings, there's just incredibly impactful. We can't really understand. I mean, it's impossible to understand the world without the Cold War, without all those sorts of things. So Hegel's kind of in the background there, right?
Yeah.
And that's thinking about him sort of in terms of what's the most obvious. A second reason that he's really important, and this is more intellectual, is that he really almost invents the philosophy of history. This is really interesting, I think, sort of lacuna in the tradition, in traditional philosophy. You know, Aristotle and Plato, I mean, obviously they're amazingly important and insightful and deep and wise. You know, they didn't really think about history, you know, like as history.
Right.
They didn't think about the idea of, when we think about history, like what is history? We could think about it as sort of the sequential record of human events or something like that, right?
Sure.
um, you know, they knew that there was history. I mean, they
Yeah.
knew that there were events in the past, and they knew some about them, but they didn't sort of theorize about the nature of human history, right? And that starts
Yeah.
to be interesting when you think about, like, well, what is human history, right? You know, I like to say something like it's the record of human events, as a baseline, right? And then
Sure.
you can
Sure. Sure.
start,
Sure.
but then just like anything else, like in philosophy, you can start to develop theories about it, right? Like, what's
Yep.
the form of it? What's the matter of it? What's the purpose of it? You know, that kind of thing. What's the cause of it? And Hegel really does that really for the first time in a systematic way. I would say
Hmm.
prior to Hegel, really it's theology that gives you a theory of history. The you know the and most, I would say in the West, most potently, Augustine's City of God,
Yeah.
right? Like that's a powerful theological vision of the nature of history, right? That the nature of history is about this sort of intermingling and struggle between the city of God and the city of man, right? And that these two, you know, cities, you know, are sort of antithetical, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
And I think Christians today, I mean, like, you know, just hearing you talk about that, you know, the thing that comes to mind is, you know, for at least for Catholics, right? Salvation history, right? So we think about history in terms of God's salvific plan, right? That's a philosophy of history in a way. That's
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
that we don't just look at the events and say, wasn't that interesting how it all played out? There's is there something behind those? Is there something hiding those? Is there something to which
Exactly.
the trajectory of those events, or a trajectory to those events that are outside of maybe like the immediate recognition of those events happening right now?
Right. Yeah.
And so it's so yeah, so I think for the Christian, that kind of idea, you know, at least for today's Christian, like that kind of idea, yeah, it makes sense. There is a philosophy of history. There is a
Sure.
understanding of it that in that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's actually kind of important, you know,
Yeah.
the we start thinking about it, like, you know, think about things like disciplines like sociology or economics, right? Those are not historical explicitly, but very often they end up doing some history because that gives you some of the data, right? So what you're
Sure.
looking for, right, if you're doing the philosophy of history, is you're looking for explanations, right?
Yeah.
And for human behavior over time and human events over time, and you can and that's sort of working as a historian. But then as a philosopher, right, you want to look at sort of the whole or the big picture of history and look for stable patterns, right?
Yeah.
Structures of history, as well as purposes, right? And really, Hegel, as I say, is, to my mind, anyways, the first one to do this in a systematic way. After Hegel, a lot of people start doing this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He's one of the first people then that really introduces, for better or worse, historical consciousness to philosophy, right? That we can't think about just consciousness abstractly. We need to think about consciousness in time and place, right? And then we give you one third, and this is maybe a minor note, but a third reason that Hegel is important is Hegel actually figures largely in a lot of views about international affairs and foreign policy. That might sound a little surprising, but he really does. I remember back in the 90s, believe it, right? Reading a book by a political theorist, we could say, named Francis Fukuyama. And the title of it was The End of History. And it was written in sort of the post-Cold War moment, right? You know, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was on the way out, right?
Yeah.
All that sort of thing. And, you know, he basically, the end of history is a phrase taken from Hegel, And Fukuyama writes this. He's what a lot of people would call a neoconservative. He writes this as, look, Hegel was right. We're experiencing the end of history right now. With the fall of the Soviet Union, we are going to enter into global democratic capitalism as far as the eye can see. And eventually, all differences, traditions, antipathies, etc., will just be sort of fade away, right?
Yeah.
Under the force of global democratic capitalism. Well, it didn't turn out that way, right? And to his credit, Fukuyama eventually admitted that was the case. But in any event, a lot of people think Hegel influences the way a lot of people think about international relationships.
Yeah.
And in terms of when we think about the relations between political communities, is it the case that there's a purpose or a structure that we can discern sort of behind those relationships? So anyways, those are three reasons I think that Hegel is interesting and important to know.
Very good. Yeah. And even when you're talking about it there, it almost has this kind of eschatological
It does.
kind of end times kind of view of history. That if we can decipher the patterns of the past, we can foresee what is coming in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's
true. And see that in Marx, especially, I know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there is an eschatological bent to Hegel too.
Yeah.
His bent isn't materialistic, right? It's more idealistic. But but he does have the idea of an end of history, right? And he thought in his own day that he had reached it, and that there was just kind of some, like cleaning up of the edges to do, maybe it was going to take a couple hundred years to clean up the edges, with it basically the form and structure of the end of history had come to be, right?
Yeah.
He calls it at one point the omega point.
The omega point. Yeah.
That's way of putting it, right?
So maybe let's dive into Hegel a little bit more.
Okay.
So what kind of is how does history develop?
Okay. Yeah.
We're not just talking about it as like a succession of events. How does history develop? How does he understand that kind of development of history playing out?
Yeah. So, Hegel is one of these really dense philosophers. I mean, I think he only wrote 4 books, but the 4 that he wrote are really thick, right? And really difficult and really turgid. But the history is probably the clearest part. And a lot of this is spelled out in his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. What that word spirit is a translation of the word Geist. And it's hard to translate Geist because Geist is a broad term in German. It certainly includes mind. It includes spirit, but not necessarily like spirits as if they were like metaphysical entities, right? Like, at least initially in German, it just means something like, I think it's very similar to the way we could say the psyche, right, as a whole, right? Yeah. So certainly your mind, but sort of your whole psyche, right, as a unit. So that's important to know because he thinks of history as essentially being the unfolding of Geist, right? Or the story of, to put it colloquially, the story of Geist realizing its own freedom, right? That's the way to put it, To understand that, though, what all that means, right? Probably a good place to start is just with this observation that he makes, which is that while he appreciates classical philosophy, he appreciates even his modern forerunners. He thinks one of the big problems with philosophy historically has been its sort of negligence with respect to history, right? So, if you think about like people like Plato and Aristotle, and most of the ancients and medievals, they're trying to get to some sort of wisdom that's based on the universal and the permanent, right?
Mhm.
And even Aristotle, right, who emphasizes change and recognizes particularity, he looks at change and the particular, but he does that in a way to get out from underneath it, right? The universal and unchanging, right? So by looking at change and looking at the particular, he unearths the universal and permanent structures of change and particularity, right? You get me? Right. So even Aristotle, who's more sensitive to this than Plato, kind of to Hegel's mind, kind of misses the mark. It's not that, of course, Hegel's no nominalist.
Yeah.
Hegel believes in the universal and the permanent, but he thinks we have to pay more attention to the details, right? We need to pay more attention to the fact that things change and that they change in a fairly radical way. So he accepts sort of the Greek achievements in philosophy,
Okay.
especially the recognition that mind is what distinguishes humanity from the other animals, right? In fact, he thinks this is extremely important, right? The Greek achievement there, but they sort of neglected the fullness of the human condition by not taking into account history and the record of radical change through history, right? And the way in which, and this should sound very contemporary, the way in which history conditions consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Right. And really that's one of Hegel's major insights, right? Is he says, look, a Persian, a subject of the Persian Empire and a citizen of 19th century France would almost be completely incapable of having a discussion, right? Even taking out the language barrier, even if you could translate accurately, right?
Sure.
That Persian of the subject of the Persian Empire and the 19th century Frenchman live in such vastly different thought worlds, right? That they would just, what's in terms of value, meaning, and purpose, they would just be almost like, I don't know, incomprehensible to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Almost speaking a different language entirely. It's so is he? But he's not a kind of a cultural relativist, is he?
No, he's not. He thinks of the great world cultures and historical epochs. And when you start studying Hegel, you start saying things like that, right? You think about things as like, there was this thing called Greek civilization, and there was this thing called Persian civilization. And they were historical cultural paradigms, right?
Yeah.
That moved through history for a certain period and then eventually go away, right? But no, he wasn't a relativist in the strong sense. He thought that he certainly introduced historical relativity as a factor and a condition of human thought.
Right.
But in a way that I think anybody would have to recognize is true, right? That, like I was saying, somebody who's living, a Greek who's living 400 years before the birth of Christ has no, his imagination doesn't include things like cancer and space shuttles, right? That's just not like, he's just like, I have no idea what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be a fair observation, right? Like without being a relativist about it, it is true that our thoughts historically conditioned, right? I mean,
absolutely.
It seems to me, just think about the way we are about things like political and value ideas about equality or democracy or things like that. The idea of monarchy seems kind of crazy to us, right? Whereas, if you lived in 13th century France, it wasn't crazy at all. The idea of democracy sounds like just nuts, right? So I think, you have to, you can be a realist, right, about knowledge and truth, and still accept a certain amount of relativity with respect to historical conditioning.
Right. So he wasn't a relativist in that way. He was just saying that a lot of past philosophies have kind of neglected this kind of area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so what's really important about that is if you look at the various civilizations. Now, one thing that's really fascinating here is the 19th century when Hegel's writing, right,
Yeah.
is really the period where history gets, for lack of a better word, scientized, right, and thematized, right? Like history becomes very like even the phrase natural history, like that we get from Darwin, and like that's a 19th century thing, right? And there's a good reason for this is that really our grasp of there is a history and we know a lot of it really comes out in the 19th century. Like what we consider history as a scientific discipline or as an academic discipline really comes from that period, right? Where you move from almost mere chroniclers, right, to antiquarians, to finally to historians, right, that you get in the 19th century. And so Hegel's like capitalizing on that historical knowledge of the time. Now, I will say this, Hegel's often wrong about the details of history, right?
Sure.
But, you want to, again, keep the big picture here. But, what he really thinks is interesting is that if you look at history, what you find is these radical differences between epochs, radical changes. He's thinking about things like the French Revolution, right? It's hard for us to recognize the earth-shattering nature of the French Revolution at its time, right? It was shocking, right, to European people. I mean, just shocking, right? And then that they cut off the head of the king and the queen. They were just like Europe was just, what is happening? I mean, imagine. I mean, you got to think about, like, if you're a contemporary American, 9/11. That it's that kind of event, right? Is the French Revolution, right? Nothing's the same afterwards, right? And probably the French Revolution more radically than even 9/11, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Why do you think so?
Well, I mean, not just it. I think the thing with the French Revolution was not just the cultural upset of modern day life. I mean, the story of, like, the Vendée and the Catholics that lived there. I mean, it's phenomenal what they went through in that, but also, but also more importantly, kind of the consequences of ideas.
Sure. Yeah.
Playing out. Whereas 9/11, it was a historical event, but we didn't all of a sudden adopt the ideas of Islam like culturally wide. Whereas that was one of the big parts of the Enlightenment, was not just a change in societal aspects and stuff, but a different way to think about in the end almost everything.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And interestingly, 9/11 didn't change the way that we think, right?
Right.
Like, now some critics called our subsequent actions, and I'm sensitive to the criticism of our subsequent military actions.
Sure.
But called them a crusade. But what's really true is we very specifically were not on a crusade. Now, what would have made 9/11 an event on the same level as the French Revolution is if 9/11 had changed us, right? Like if we had been like, oh, we're going after Islam as such, right? As if it were like a real crusade, right? That would have made 9/11 even more important, right? In terms of culture and history, right? As it is, it's still catastrophic, especially in terms of international relations. But it didn't quite reach the French Revolution, which affected everything, right? At the deepest levels. So anyways, when you look at history in those terms, what he thinks you see is that Geist itself, that is mind, is the human psyche, is changing. And that's a radical departure, right? Aristotle and Plato don't think about like the idea that reason changes, right? The idea that mind or consciousness changes itself is not something on their radar. They might think, oh, the objects change some,
sure,
right? But not Geist itself, right? Whereas Hegel thinks if you look at history enough, you see that Geist is still always Geist, right? It's not a new species, but it itself changes from different civilizations.
So when he's talking about Geist, he's not talking about obviously not the Holy Spirit, but and he's not necessarily talking about something that exists outside of human consciousness, but he's talking more about kind of the collective consciousness of the people that are alive at that time make up, and those people change. Geist is still there, and Geist changes. Like Geist doesn't have existence outside of human minds.
Yeah. So I'll give you two answers.
How do we understand that?
Right. So both answers I'm gonna give you are correct with respect to Hegel, but one of them is deeper than the other. So I'll give you the more superficial answer first. So you're probably familiar with the term zeitgeist.
Yeah, spirit of the time.
Spirit of the time. That's a very good way to initially think of Geist, right?
Okay.
And it's true of what Hegel thinks, right? So this is similar to Kant's concept of public reason. That is that there is a kind of collective consciousness, if you like, that we all share and all are contributing to, right?
Sure.
Just think about our shared experience of COVID, right? And COVID-19 and all the different, ramifications and that go with that. That's kind of an example of Geist, right? And so there is that sense of sort of shared consciousness, right? That Hegel would like to say is true of Geist. It's true within the individual, right?
Right.
But actually, and this is really interesting and very consistent for Hegel, I think that Hegel would say that collective consciousness is more determinative and more important than individual consciousness.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I would say that the majority of people on Twitter would agree with you.
Twitter's such a wonderful example, though, right? Like, wonderful and awful. I mean, we forget that I think only like what percent of the population is actually on Twitter?
Oh, it's only like 10%.
Yeah, it's like this tiny percent, but it has such huge impact, right? Culturally. But think about Facebook, social media, all of that, right? Those would be excellent examples of collective consciousness. But I think he thinks of collective consciousness as more important because he really sees the individual as an expression of collective consciousness, right?
Yeah.
In all its different varieties. So you could be a left-wing, Black Lives Matter activist, or you could be kind of a right-wing libertarian, right? Both of those Hegel would see as particular instantiations of the American consciousness, or the American zeitgeist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The American zeitgeist makes it possible for Jim to be a right-wing libertarian and Jill to be a left-wing critical race theorist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of interesting. We don't tend to think that way. We tend to think inside out, right?
Right.
But Hegel doesn't see it that way. Hegel really thinks that culture and the zeitgeist are prior to, right, individuality and individual consciousness, right? What do you think about that?
I don't fully disagree with him.
Yeah.
But like it's looking at history from the point of view, the mind being behind all these events.
Yeah, right.
That the mind does change with time. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. I one way I explain this is take the idea that you need to. One way I explain it in my class this past semester is take the idea that you need to rebel against your family, and that's natural and healthy part of your growth and maturity, right?
Sure.
That's almost an American commonplace, right? Oh, yeah. Teenagers, of course, rebel, and it's kind of healthy for them to rebel, right?
Yeah.
If you had told somebody take the vast history of China, right? I mean, China's so old, right? but say prior to, the Communist Revolution, it's basically Taoist and Confucian. If you had told people, anybody in China, that, they would have looked at you with complete incomprehension. They would have thought you were saying something like, it's good for me to stab myself in the eye. Right? I mean, that's the way they would. I mean, literally, the idea that you would rebel against your ancestors, you would rebel against your father, right? That completely incomprehensible to a Confucian outlook or a Taoist outlook, right? That would be like stabbing yourself in the eye, right? There's such a deep connection with tradition and ancestry in ancient China, right? Pre-modern China, right? That it really would, like, you think of yourself as an extension of the ancestors, right? And everything about you is an extension of your ancestors. Then look at America. That sounds crazy to us, right? Our ancestors are all racist and we hate them, right? You know what I mean? Like that, like that's kind of the way we are. And we're kind of like, oh, my grandparents, like your grandparents, they're silly and old, and we'll be nice to them. But we'll be nice to them, but we don't revere them, right? Even people on the right, all the time are, bashing the boomers, right? And it's sort of like, like these. But here, I say both. I bring those two things out to show you the different forms of consciousness, right? Different forms of Geist, right? Even different conceptions of what it means to be conscious, right? To a Confucian, rebelling is destroying yourself, right? You have no self outside of your ancestors, right? For us, the self achieves itself by rebelling against the ancestors. You see how radically, deeply different that is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we make I think, in today's, maybe a good kind of analogous way to understand this is, I mean, like, that's almost the exact argument we make with regards to gender. Like, you're against your very nature. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. But then we're like, kids are
kids are kids. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So that's interesting. Again.
Hegel's got his point here, I think, right? That collective consciousness here really has a certain priority, right? That over some given individual named Ming or Bob, right? Ming is going to think about ancestry, right, and maturity and growth in a way that's sort of not predetermined, but we'll say at least conditioned by the collective consciousness of Confucian China, right? And Bob is going to think about his self, right, and in a way that's preconditioned by the American, right, zeitgeist or collective consciousness. So there is that point there. So what is Geist? One way of thinking about Geist is collective consciousness or zeitgeist, like we talked about. And importantly, Hegel thinks that it has a certain priority over individual consciousness. Now, there's a deeper explanation that, I don't want to go into too much in this episode. Maybe we'll do it in another one. But there is a deeper explanation of Geist that really is sort of like, you said something like, I think you said something like you were skeptical that Geist existed outside of humans or individual humans, right?
Yeah. Does it have real existence?
Yeah. So I think what you want to do is just flip that on its head and say you should really be skeptical of individual existence outside of Geist.
Okay.
That is that Geist. So what I just said earlier was kind of a cultural, historical, sociological explanation of the priority of Geist, right?
Yeah.
Hegel takes that though and then extrapolates a metaphysical and epistemological priority of Geist, right?
Got it.
That is that ultimately Geist is sort of, you should think of it as a person. It's kind of more like an energy, right? Or a field of reality, and everything grows out of Geist project, so to speak.
Okay.
The energy that is Geist. That's why technically in metaphysics, he's an idealist, right?
Yeah.
He's the opposite of a materialist. He's a metaphysical idealist. He thinks that the ideal is the real and that the real is the ideal.
Yeah, which again is interesting that somebody like Karl Marx would pick him up. Karl Marx is a radical materialist.
That's right. That's right.
He's like, yes, I'm going to pick up this idealist, right?
Right.
That's interesting. All right.
Yeah. And well, just one comment about Marx along those lines is, if you're studying Marxism, and we've done extended episodes on it, on him, and I recommend them. One thing to really latch onto is he calls the material dialectic of history, right?
Right.
And that's taking a Hegelian term, which is the dialectic of history, and changing it, right? But also it also sort of in homage to Hegel, saying, hey, I think you got something right, Hegel,
Yeah, you're just completely wrong about it being the
that's right. That's right.
Completely material. All right, so let's look at maybe, so you have kind of this Geist changing, this consciousness changing, and there's he talks about kind of the stages of the mind. How do we understand maybe like progress or the progression of history?
Sure.
In Hegel's thought, where is it going?
Yeah, that's a great term to use, progression of history, right? Because Hegel really does, he's not a progressive in the political sense, right? But he does think that history is progressing towards a certain end, right? A certain goal. And so not only looking at history is important, because if we look at history, we learn that Geist changes. Well, is that you could take that in a radically relativist direction, right? It just changes all the time, and there's no commensurability between the changes. Hegel doesn't go that route. Hegel thinks there is a connection, and that actually that connection is progress towards a specific goal, right?
Right.
And that specific goal is the full awareness. Let me restate. That is Geist's full awareness of its own freedom, right? That is the goal of history, right? Now, what does Hegel mean by freedom? There's a lot to be said there, but one initial thing, I'll just say the initial thing, is that freedom is derived from our self-awareness, right? Self-awareness in the sense that we become aware of the various possibilities that are available to us. Now, I think that's a helpful way of putting it, because that shows you how Geist and freedom could be conditioned by historical circumstances.
Sure.
Right. Again, to an ancient Greek or Roman, the possibility of there being no slavery would have been absurd.
Yeah.
You said you have a civilization and an economy that doesn't have slaves in it. How can you get anything done?
Yeah.
Right. Like it was just, it completely incomprehensible. Right. To them. To modern 21st century Americans, the idea of slavery seems incomprehensible in itself. Right.
Yeah.
And so you think about that in terms of the possibilities, right? That people of different races could live in the same country and form a civilization together, right? That wouldn't have been a possibility to many different cultures historically, right? Over time, our self-awareness, that is our awareness of the various possibilities that are available to me, expands and expands and expands.
Yeah, that's
right? And so that awareness of possibility is our freedom. Does that make sense? Yeah,
it does. And I think, a good way to think about, or a good way to see how this idea of history is played out is, Marx takes a kind of an economical view of this, of saying, things like, the slavery model of economics, the necessary step in this progression, or, capitalism is a very step towards, in socialism, towards communism. So for Hegel, then, this, as we progress through history, we understand just all of the options to us, and at that point, Geist is going to have this kind of full realization
Yes, of its
Everything that is
possibilities.
before it and its possibilities. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and then sort of a Kantian rational determination of all possibilities. And sorry, that's the mouthful, but
What?
right, and that will be the fullness of
Yeah.
freedom, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot here,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's the goal, right? And it just, again, the easy thing to connect with here, at least initially, and then there's kind of a fuller version, but
Sure.
initially, the thing you can grab onto is the idea that self-awareness
Mhm.
and freedom are correlated.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it's a very anthropocentric. It's very just
Mhm.
complete. I don't want to say self-centered because
Yeah, it's actually not. Yeah, it's weirdly not. Yeah.
yeah, because like you said, it's the collective is more
Yeah.
individual.
He's very clear on this. He's very social and communitarian, I guess, in his outlook. Right.
Yeah.
He considers what he calls Anglo-Saxon individualism, right, to be a kind of
Yeah.
form of immaturity.
Yeah.
He thinks it's not the worst thing. He does think it does represent a certain kind of freedom, but it's an immature version of freedom compared to the proper Prussian understanding of freedom. Right?
Such a German.
That's right. So I know we've gone long here, but I want to just kind of run through a couple
Yeah.
of historical, what Hegel gives as some historical account that supports this hypothesis about freedom, right?
Sure.
His theory of freedom. And I'm just going to hit some of the high points here. Now, again, Hegel, you might dispute, and plenty of historians would dispute his account of history, right? But for his time, this was a decent account, right? And again, you're looking at history as not just a sequence of events, but the meaning of that sequence of events, right?
Yeah.
The purpose of that sequence of events. And so he sees sort of the clash between Persia, the Persian Empire, and the Greek city-states, right?
Mhm.
As being like not just a military economic clash. Certainly it was that, right?
Right.
But more importantly, a spiritual and cultural contest, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Because what you have there, he thinks, are two ideas of freedom. The Persian view of freedom is there's God, and then there's God on earth, who is the Persian emperor. And he's free, and everybody else is free by obeying him.
Yeah.
Right? Their freedom exists in obedience to the Persian emperor. Isn't that interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because by obeying him, who is the only one who is free, right? Because he's almost an embodiment, or at least a representative of God, that they're able to be free by obedience to the one free man, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not the Greek idea,
right?
The Greeks are like, hell no, right? You're not taking over us Athenians, us Corinthians, us Spartans, right? Us Thebans, right? You follow me? So one thing that's so there's a sense of a kind of plural, sort of pluralism, right? Kind of a civic pluralism in ancient Greece, where we recognize that there are different peoples within Greece, right? Different city-states, and they share a culture, right? Mm-hmm. But they also are very different,
right? And this is, and for our listeners, this is what when Hegel's talking about the historical dialectical.
That's right, yeah.
That there's always going to be these kind of two opposing forces, and out of this fight comes real progression. Out of this, and again, you see that this idea of kind of those two competing, or those two kind of fighting factions, dialectic. You see this in that big idea you see in a lot of people that come after Hegel.
That's right. That's right.
Of course, one of them. Yeah. So when we're looking, when we're going through these historical events, there's always going to be this clash, right?
That's right. Clash. Yeah, there's always a clash, right? Until the end of history, right?
Right.
And it Hegel's mind a necessary clash, and he actually thinks of each stage as necessary. So
yeah.
it's kind of like, there are peaks and valleys in history, but he sees it kind of going in a trajectory, right?
Sure.
It's all going towards this end. They're all necessary steps, right? So the Persian Empire had to exist for the Greeks to realize in themselves how much they were free, independent communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Greeks wouldn't have been as free as they were if it wasn't for the pressure of imperial Persia, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting, right? So now I've said Greek communities, the freedom of the communities. Hegel and a lot of Germans at this time think of Greece as a place of almost idyllic harmony, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is, the Greek city-states in themselves, not between themselves, but in themselves.
Right.
Now, this is overstated, to be sure, but there's a little kernel of truth that I kept saying things like, we Thebans and we Corinthians are free to ourselves, right? To Hegel's mind, there wasn't an individual consciousness of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
There was a community group consciousness of freedom. We Athenians are not going to be told what to do by you Persians.
Yeah.
Right.
We Texans.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. But there's no individual consciousness there, he thought. Right.
Yeah.
That is, people thought of themselves as an extension of the community. Right. And so they were in harmony with the community. They did what they wanted, but what they wanted was the same thing that the community wanted. Do you follow that idea?
Yeah.
So they were free in that sense, but not free in the radical sense of recognizing that you could rebel against your community, right?
Yeah.
Do you see the difference, right?
Oh, yeah. There's a huge difference. Yeah.
And so there's a kind of freedom there. And again, Hegel respects it, but he thinks it's inadequate because it doesn't give a full recognition to self-awareness and freedom.
Yeah.
We'll go on for a little while. I don't want to get into all the details because I know we're going
sure.
long. One of the places that he thinks is one of the epochs of history is very important is Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm.
He thinks that the special and necessary stage of Christianity, or form of consciousness, right, that Christianity introduces, and this is so fascinating, is the dignity and full freedom of the individual, right? Comes forward in Christianity because we're all made in the image and likeness of God, and because God became man, right?
Yeah.
So that the creator of the universe becomes one, right, with humanity, which shows humans that we are connected with, even though we're changing and all that, we're connected with the divine and the highest, right? So that the individual all of a sudden becomes, in that case, he thinks Christianity begins really individual consciousness, right? Individual awareness, individual self-valuing, right? Because God loves us, and we're made in his image. The individual as the individual, right, is important, is valuable, and is something to be self-aware of. Do you follow that? Yeah.
No, that's interesting. And even in, like you said, like kind of that, that was a fairly new idea.
Sure. Yeah.
Made in the image and likeness of God. That's a radically Christian idea.
Yeah, that's right.
You read all the other creation accounts of Roman gods and stuff. We were not.
That's right. We're lucky if the gods don't, do whatever they want to us.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So he sees Christianity is very important in the growth of consciousness and freedom. One of the problems, though, that happened, the antithesis of early Christianity, in his view, is Roman Catholicism, right? Because in his view, you have this beautiful birth of individual awareness and consciousness and self-valuing in Christianity that then is Romanized, right?
Yeah.
And what does Rome stand for? Rome stands for law and stands for order, right? And hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Rome as an imperial entity. So then if Rome as an imperial entity then takes over Christianity, what does it do to Christianity? It makes it legalistic. It makes it ordered. It makes it hierarchical, right?
Yeah.
So there's something within Catholicism that's good, right? This original ideas of Christianity covered over, right, by Roman Catholicism. Now, the solution to that, of course, is that this is very German, right? Is Martin Luther, right? and the Protestant Reformation, right? Martin Luther to him is like one of the epical figures in the world stage, not because he's dogmatically Lutheran. He doesn't really care too much about the details of Lutheranism, right? But
he's getting rid of Rome.
He's getting rid of Rome and setting Geist free. And he thinks that what the Protestant Reformation did for us is it helped, it elevated the conscience of the individual believer, right?
And
by doing so, advanced freedom, right? So you kind of get this way of thinking here. Does that make sense? Again, obviously we're not going to accept the underlying theses, but it's an interesting account.
Sure. And for Hegel, then each of these, whether we're talking about, like you said, Greece and Rome, or Roman Catholicism and the Reformation and things like that, all kind of necessary kind of steps as we progress towards this kind of utopian idea
that's right
of freedom.
That's right.
Of Geist experience. Now, how does the individual, though, maybe to close, how does the individual then live in this? Hegel see the individual living in this ultimate Geist at the end of human history.
So this will take a few minutes to explain, but I think I can do it concisely. The end of history, right? He thinks that they've basically reached in his time in Prussia. Yeah, and that's sort of shocking because Prussia at that time, the crown prince of Prussia, the last king of Prussia, who then became the first German emperor, gave Hegel a medal, right? They love Hegel, right? But Prussia at that time had official censorship. That was state policy. They had a kind of assembly that met every once in a while, but they were basically advisory. The state was basically run by bureaucrats and by aristocrats, right? And there was a monarchy, and it was an officially Lutheran state. And so this is the fullness of freedom. And Hegel would say, yes, it is, my friend. And here's why. So it's one thing at the end of history to realize, as things go by, as the Protestant Reformation does its work, to realize your self-awareness, right, and the fullness of possibilities for yourself and for all of humanity, right? That's what he calls that. Once you go for all of your possibilities and for all of humanity, not just yourself,
all of humanity,
that is the subjective full awareness of Geist freedom, right? Interestingly, though, he doesn't think that is, he thinks that that's incomplete and inadequate until that freedom is fully realized in our external circumstances. It's inadequate, right? And that's why the end of history has to be a political arrangement, right? And because it needs to be realized. Now, you could say, well, that means what we need then is kind of something close to anarchy or some sort of libertarian, night watchman kind of government, right? Just bare minimum, right? And we'll have, no regulation on prostitution or drugs or anything like that, because those are just possibilities, right? And he would say that is what you're expressing is an immature, as I said earlier, Anglo-Saxon idea of freedom, which is the freedom from constraint, right?
Yeah.
I can do whatever I want to do. And Hegel, and this is the part where he's right, wants to say that's not actually freedom. And the reason he says that is because our desires are not necessarily free, right? They just happen to us. That could be physiological, but it could also be cultural. It could also be manipulated by outside forces. So that if you're acting on your desires, really what's in charge then are the things that elicit your desire, right? The external objects. You following the logic here, right? So think about let's say that you're subject to a marketing campaign that's very effective, and over time it causes in you this weird desire, right, to go on vacation to X, right? Your life is just going to be incomplete without doing so, right? And so you get out that credit card and you pay for that super fancy vacation, right? And of course, you 6 months later you regret it, right? Were you free? Were you really being free when you capitulated to that marketing campaign to go for an expensive, fancy vacation that you didn't need? And Hegel would say, no, you weren't really free, right? You followed your desires, but you were manipulated into it, right? You weren't being truly free. To be truly free, he thinks, is to act on a rational principle, right? And by rational, he means universally and consistently applicable, a la Kant. And so, not to get in the weeds too much here, but he thinks you have to be really free, you have to follow the categorical imperative. That is, that you should only do those things that you would universally will all to do. But for you to do that individually is not enough, because it doesn't change the circumstances of your life. What it has to be is you have to have a government that acts on that and enforces that into all of society. Right. So that all of the institutions then are changed to follow the categorical imperative. Now I'm simplifying, but does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've definitely taken us into the weeds. despite your
efforts not to do so.
Let
me give you one. This worked well with my students, but let me give you a really relevant contemporary example. Between using Hegel's term, Anglo-Saxon freedom and proper Prussian freedom, right? Think about the way that people responded to mask and vaccine mandates re-COVID-19, right? To Hegel's mind, this would be a perfect example, right, of mature versus immature freedom, right? The one group is like, to hell with you, you're not going to tell me what I put on my face. Right? That's individualistic Anglo-Saxon freedom and
immature freedom.
That's right, because you can't categorically universalize it, right? And I think Hegel would say that. Whereas this is weird, forcing people to wear a mask, right? Now it'd be better, of course, if the state says wear a mask, Jason, you say, yes, sir, I'm happy to do so, right? That would be your true freedom, because you're in harmony with the state, right? You're not in rebellion because you want to follow the universal categorical imperative. The government's giving you the universal categorical imperative, and you're all in harmony, right? But so it's not an oppression of your freedom, it's an exercise of your freedom to obey the state in its mandates there. Now, if you happen to be one of these rebellious people, in Hegel's view, then we're going to have to force you. Right. And that's too bad. That's because you're immature. Right. Sorry. But that actually the voluntarily obeying the mask mandates would be a good example, I think, of Hegelian freedom.
That's a great wrap up our conversation. I'm gonna depart from Hegel on this.
But it is kind of fascinating there, right? Isn't it?
I think there's there are some things that are attractive in Hegel's view, right? So like the relational view of the human person, right? That's something, especially in America, where that can get overshadowed by strict individualism or something like that. Like Hegel does take into account that we don't exist in vacuums and things like that. The importance of community and relationships and things like that, and that we we do understand ourselves in relationships, and those are important. Yeah, but again, like there's so much of this that we could go on probably for another podcast talking about like Hegel with regard to God and atheism, and is he theistic and things like, because that's an interesting topic, I think. But just kind of that understanding of there's no reference to the good, the true, the beautiful. There's no reference to virtue, unless I guess you're saying obedience to the state in some sense, like that, virtuous.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what he thinks. Yeah, there's a sense of right. He has one of his books is called The Philosophy of Right. And in that he lays out basically a very thoroughgoing account of Kantian / Hegelian ethics and political philosophy.
Right, which places so much emphasis on just kind of moral duty, as opposed to doing what is authentically good. And
that Aristotelian sort of idea of the good is out. Yeah,
we've left that behind. Yeah, we've
progressed. It was that's right. It was necessary at some stage, right? But now we've gone beyond that.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Smith, that's very interesting. Given us a lot to think about, and I hope our listeners can see kind of some of the ideas that we talked about within Hegel. You can see how those are being played out today, or even just hints of them, because Hegel, in Hegel's view of history in this sense, really did shape much of 20th century thought on a lot of things, not just politics, but when you look at Marx, economics, and metaphysics, if you can even call it a metaphysics again. So there's a lot there to think about, a lot there to consider. And so I want to thank all our listeners for joining us today. Check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. And until next time, God bless.